In this video, I want to talk to you about how to break a long-standing pattern of behavior. And I'm not talking about habits. I'm not talking about small things that are action-based, like forgetting to take your supplements a few days a week. I'm talking about things like people-pleasing, like self-criticism, like perfectionism, like overthinking. Things that have been with us often since childhood that show up across a lot of areas of our life. Right? So I work with people on this a lot, and there are a few common mistakes that I see people make. And in this video, I'm going to point them out to you so that you don't make the same ones. All right, so I'm going to show this on the whiteboard so that hopefully it makes more sense. All right, now this is you, okay? And you are going through your life. And let's consider this life sort of like pre-enlightenment, okay? So there was a time whenever you were, whatever pattern is true for you, that you were doing for most of your life and you didn't even really realize it. Now, for the sake of clarity, I'm just going to stick with one example, and let's talk about self-criticism throughout the rest of this video. Because while we all deal with different patterns, most people on some level deal with self-criticism. Okay, so in the past, what your life looked like is there would be various events in your life, and they would occur, and then after they occurred, you would judge yourself or be in self-criticism. All right, and we're going to show that with this red line. And depending on your specific story, these might be things that happened at increments, or it might feel like they were just one on top of another. I know some people can feel like almost every moment of their day is spent in self-criticism because this pattern is so deeply wired into how they show up in the world. But for the sake of the argument, let's look at it's individual events that then trigger self-criticism. All right, so this was life, and you did this for a while, and you didn't even necessarily realize that that was a problem. And then something happens, like maybe you read a book, maybe you listened to a teacher, maybe you went to therapy, maybe you worked with a coach, whatever it is, and now you are aware of this pattern, and you are aware that it is not serving you, okay? This is your enlightenment, and now you know. Okay, and now you know that it's not serving you, and you would like to step out of this pattern, and you would like to not do this anymore because you recognize it is not serving you. This is what I see most people do, and they don't realize that they're doing it, is they end up bringing the pattern that they are trying to break to the process of breaking the pattern. And that makes sense because, again, these are things that have been with us since childhood. They're showing up across all different areas of our life. So an event happens, and they're in self-criticism, and then what do? What do? We criticize ourselves for the self-criticism, right? I know better. I'm supposed to not be doing this anymore. This isn't serving me. I really need to stop. Why can't I get my act together? And instead of stepping out of the pattern, what happens is we actually strengthen it. We compound it. And you see this in so many areas. You see people overthinking, and then they go into further overthinking. You see people trying to step out of anger, and they get angry, and then they get angry at themselves for being angry. We get frustrated, and then we're frustrated at ourselves for being frustrated. And this enlightening and this awareness that this isn't serving us, if we don't know how to actually step out of the pattern, can actually just lead to strengthening it because we aren't being conscious about bringing a new way of being to the process. All right, so this is what we don't want to do. We don't want to see ourselves compounding it and re-strengthening the pattern. So before I tell you what we are going to do, there are two things that you need to understand and that we need to bring to this work. One is that once something is in the past, you can't change it. Now, most people recognize that, but so often they think distant past. I mean 1 second, 1/10 of a second. If you have the ability to be conscious of a thought that you just had, it is now in the past and it cannot be changed. And what I see most people doing is spending all of their energy thinking about the thing that is over that they cannot change. And what they miss out on is that the place that they have power right now is in their next conscious thought. So if something is over, by the time you realize you had a self-critical thought, you can no longer change it. The thought you have control over and the place that you have the most power in breaking patterns is the next thought, the next conscious thought that you have. Okay? The other thing that you need to recognize with breaking patterns is that this way of being, self-criticism in this case, is wired into your brain and nervous system. The brain is efficient. It learns over time. A happens and we do B. X equals Y. This is how it works. And it operates off of programming. These are neural pathways, and this is a simplification of the science, but to a certain extent, the brain simply learns that this is how we respond in these situations. And it goes down well-worn neural pathways, the way that the brain is wired to respond based on past history, okay? And the brain is going to continue to do that because it is what's wired in. And guys, 95% of all of your thinking is subconscious brain wiring. 95% of it. So when people miss this and they have this enlightenment that this is not serving me, they miss the fact that this is going to continue to happen to a certain extent on an unconscious level because it's brain wiring. Okay, there is no scenario in which you are going to be able to be conscious of every single thought during the day and catch every single one and change every single one in the moment because, guys, we have about 60,000 of them a day. So as you step into the work of breaking a pattern, you need to do it with the acceptance that rewiring the brain takes time. It takes time and it takes practice and it doesn't happen overnight. And so we have to have a plan for what we do whenever the brain goes down those well-worn pathways, all right? So I want to talk to you, with that being true, so what can we do? How do we break out of this pattern? And there are two main ways. Now, the first one is perhaps the one that you're more familiar with. What we can do for certain things, not all things, is that we can get out in front of predictable scenarios in which we are conscious of, when this happens, I find myself in self-criticism. And I know that this is a situation that triggers self-criticism for me. So we can become aware of like, okay, this is a situation where self-criticism shows up for me, and I'm aware of it. And what's going to happen is whenever I get to that scenario, I'm going to be conscious of my thinking, and I'm going to show up in a different way. I'm going to not even go to the self-critical thoughts because I'm so conscious and aware. Right? And I'm going to walk myself through a predetermined way of thinking all throughout the event so that it doesn't even happen. We can do that with predictable scenarios that we have the ability to prepare for. But again, this takes a high degree of consciousness and being able to remain conscious throughout the entire thing, which is very, very difficult to do. The other thing with this that I want to point out is if you are trying to do this, that you have to actually be picking what you are going to think instead. This is another common pitfall where people just go to, I'm going to not criticize myself. Okay, this thing's going to happen and I'm just going to do nothing. I'll just have no thoughts. There's no scenario where you have no thoughts. You can't go more than 3 seconds without having a thought. And if you don't have a plan, if you're not looking out for it and you don't have it, this is what I'm going to think instead, your brain is going to go down the pathway that it's used to. Okay, it's going to go down that well-worn pathway of self-criticism. So you can't just have no thoughts. If you don't have a plan, it's going to go to the self-critical ones. But you can do this to a certain extent, but you cannot do it all the time, okay? Because there are going to be things that happen that are unpredictable, okay? There are new scenarios, there are different scenarios, there are things that you didn't know were going to happen today, there are things that you didn't know were going to come up. And the fact that 95% of thinking is unconscious. So this, I would say, yeah, you can maybe do that for, maybe 5% of this all of this work of pattern breaking is going to be this type of thing. Okay, it's going to be this type of thing. And this 5% is really powerful because it does rewire the brain over the time. But what we have to do is, what do we do with the other 95%? What do we do the other 95% of the time whenever we find ourselves in self-criticism, because that is what the brain is wired to do, okay? So what we do in those cases is we don't spend time arguing with the past and saying, I shouldn't have been self-critical. We don't bring the self-criticism to the criticism. As soon as we recognize we were in self-criticism, We have a plan for what we do now. And we bring a new pattern in. Okay, so event still happens, initial self-criticism still happens, but then we don't repeat the pattern, we step outside of it. And guys, it is completely fine if this initial self-criticism happens as long as you interrupt the pattern and you bring a new pattern to it. Because this is still breaking the pattern. This is you choosing to not show up in the same way that you've been showing up. This is still part of how we rewire the brain and we create a new way of being in the world. Okay, so this still works. So for most of us, the majority of breaking patterns and breaking cycles is not about the pattern itself. It's about how we respond in the present moment when we recognize we've been in a pattern. Pattern still happens, and then what are you going to consciously think in the moment? And is it going to be a repeat of the pattern, or is it going to be stepping outside of it? This is how we rewire the brain. And the great news with this is that because of how the brain works, it does not need to be perfect. You do not need to never have any self-critical thoughts to get out of the pattern of self-criticism. All that needs to happen is when you recognize you are in self-criticism, you show up differently. You respond with kindness. Instead of event, self-criticism, and more self-criticism, it's event, self-criticism, kindness. Acceptance, understanding, compassion, making space for your humanity, doing anything that is positive and different than what you've been doing. This is how we break a pattern. It's not in it never happening. It's about how we show up consciously when we become aware of it. And in so many ways, guys, this is a numbers game, I guess is what I want to say. You have a current pathway. Think of it as like your initial, pathway number one that is the old thinking. And your brain is very used to it. It's very used to firing down this pathway. It's done it a long time. It's a very strong neural pathway. And the brain is always going to go to the pathway that it's most familiar with and that is strongest. And what we're trying to do is wire in a new pathway. And right now, it's very weak. You've practiced it a little bit, but not very much. And the key is not about never, ever, ever letting this happen. The key is about, over time, can we make this one stronger and this one weaker? And it becomes a numbers game. And so if every time you have a self-critical thought, you match it with a kind one and a compassionate one, and one that makes space for your humanity, and one that's full of gratitude. And if every single time this happens, you use it as a jumping off point to rewire in a different way of talking to yourself and being in the world and showing up in your life, over time, the scales begin to tip. And that old pattern starts to die out and weaken and not become the thing that your brain goes to automatically. And the second pathway gets stronger and more familiar, and the brain gets used to doing that until over time, this one becomes automatic. Okay? Now, that doesn't mean that it's never going to show up. It doesn't mean that we're never, ever going to have a self-critical thought. It's a very, very common pattern that we find ourselves in. But if when it happens, we can bring compassion and understanding and kindness to the pattern and we don't repeat it, we won't keep strengthening it. This is how we break out of a pattern. If you guys will apply this, if you will take this to heart, you will get there. But don't believe that it needs to be perfect. It doesn't. A lot of this is going to be repeating. Okay, it's going to be repetitive and doing this work over and over and over again. This is how we rewire the brain. It takes time. But don't get caught in the trap of believing it has to be perfect. We just need over time to see the scales tip.